In the early summer of 2022, the Fairborn household was the embodiment of suburban perfection. Nestled within the affluent community of Riverside Heights in Austin, Texas, their home was an architectural marvel. Every detail of the house spoke to the creative touch of Olivia Fairborn, an art teacher known for her vibrant murals and whimsical sculptures. Her talent was matched only by her kindness, a trait that endeared her to her students and colleagues alike. Her husband, Oliver Fairborn, was equally admired. As a rising star at a prestigious investment firm, his charm and ambition made him a favorite among clients and colleagues. Together, they were the golden couple of their community, flawlessly balancing their professional successes with their shared life. They were the kind of couple who hosted lively dinner parties, attended charity galas, and strolled through the neighborhood hand in hand, the picture of marital bliss. But behind the facade, cracks were beginning to form. Olivia's heart ached with a yearning she could no longer ignore. After years of unsuccessful fertility treatments, the silence of their childless home had grown deafening. Her once vivid paintings began to take on darker hues, reflecting her inner turmoil. Yet, she buried her pain beneath her cheerful demeanor, channeling her emotions into her art and her students. For Oliver, the pressure of their unspoken struggles weighed heavily. While he excelled at crafting financial solutions for his clients, he found himself increasingly distant from Olivia. The easy intimacy they once shared had been replaced by a strained politeness, and he sought solace in the familiarity of his work. Late nights at the office became a convenient escape, a way to avoid the elephant in the room. Amid this quiet tension, Charlotte Prescott emerged as an unexpected source of comfort. Olivia's mother, a former photojournalist with a free-spirited air, had always been a steady presence in her daughter's life. Now widowed and living alone in her charming cottage in Rosewood Hollow, Charlotte often visited Olivia, offering motherly wisdom and a listening ear. Her quirky stories of world travels and her lush garden filled with fragrant blooms brought a sense of warmth and nostalgia to the Fairborn household. For Oliver, Charlotte represented a different kind of solace. Her worldly charm and calming presence provided a stark contrast to the tension at home. Over shared glasses of wine at family dinners, their conversations began to extend beyond polite pleasantries. Charlotte's wit and understanding felt like a balm to his fraying nerves, and he found himself drawn to her more than he cared to admit. It was during one of these family gatherings that Charlotte let slip a story from her past, a tale of unrequited love and heartbreak. Oliver listened intently, captivated by the vulnerability in her voice. Across the room, Olivia, busy setting the table, missed the lingering look exchanged between her husband and her mother. In the eyes of the Riverside Heights community, the Fairborn family remained untouchable. Neighbors admired their bond, their home, and their apparent success. Yet, beneath the polished veneer, an emotional distance was quietly widening. Olivia, oblivious to the storm brewing within her own family, continued to pour her heart into her work, unaware that her sanctuary was on the brink of betrayal. The first fracture in their perfect family portrait was subtle, barely a crack. But it was enough to signal the beginning of the unraveling. By June 2022, the Fairborn household no longer felt like the harmonious haven it once was. The subtle cracks in Olivia and Oliver's marriage began to widen, fueled by frustrations and unmet expectations. What once were shared dreams of a future together now felt like separate paths diverging in silence. For Olivia, the weight of infertility had become unbearable. Each failed attempt to conceive chipped away at her spirit. The baby room she once painted in soft pastels now stood empty, a haunting reminder of their struggle. Instead of discussing her pain with Oliver, she retreated to her art, creating pieces that grew darker and more introspective with each passing day. Her once vibrant canvases, bursting with color and life, now featured muted tones and heavy brushstrokes, mirroring the turmoil she refused to voice. Oliver, on the other hand, turned to his work to escape the tension at home. Late nights at the office became his new normal, though not all those hours were spent behind his desk. The man who once brought flowers home, just because, now seemed preoccupied and distant. Olivia noticed the shift but couldn't bring herself to confront him. The unspoken chasm between them only grew wider. Amid this growing emotional distance, Charlotte Prescott became a comforting constant. Her presence was steady, reliable, and warm, a stark contrast to the strained atmosphere between Olivia and Oliver. Charlotte often visited their home in Riverside Heights, bringing over her signature lemon bars or freshly picked flowers from her garden in Rosewood Hollow. She would sit with Olivia, sipping tea, listening intently as her daughter spoke about her art and students. Olivia found these moments grounding, a reprieve from the chaos brewing in her marriage. But Charlotte's relationship with Oliver was evolving in a way neither of them had anticipated. It began innocently enough. During one of Charlotte's regular visits, she stayed for dinner, and Oliver arrived home earlier than usual. Olivia excused herself briefly to take a call from a colleague, leaving Oliver and Charlotte alone in the kitchen. Over glasses of wine, the conversation drifted from small talk to deeper, more personal topics. Charlotte spoke candidly about her loneliness since her husband's passing, the quiet emptiness of her home, and how she missed the days of lively family gatherings. Oliver, in turn, opened up about his frustrations at work and the growing distance between himself and Olivia. As the evening wore on, an unexpected camaraderie began to form. Charlotte's empathetic nature made it easy for Oliver to confide in her, and her witty remarks drew out a rare laugh from him. When Olivia returned to the room, she found them laughing softly over one of Charlotte's travel stories. It was a harmless moment, or so it seemed. From that night on, Oliver found himself looking forward to Charlotte's visits more than he cared to admit. Her presence brought a sense of ease that he hadn't felt in months. Unlike Olivia, who seemed consumed by her art and the looming shadow of their infertility, Charlotte was attentive and understanding. She listened without judgment and offered advice laced with wisdom and charm. For Oliver, it was like stepping into a different world, one where he wasn't failing as a husband or a partner, but simply being seen and appreciated. Charlotte, too, felt something shift. At first, she dismissed the attention from Oliver as harmless gratitude. After all, she was only helping her daughter's marriage by being a supportive presence, wasn't she? But as their interactions grew more frequent and more personal, a part of her began to feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She hated to admit it, even to herself, but she started to look forward to the moments when Oliver would drop by her cottage under the pretense of fixing something or delivering something Olivia had forgotten. It was during one of these visits that the first real boundary was crossed. Oliver arrived at Charlotte's cottage one late afternoon, claiming he had some free time and thought he'd check on her leaky kitchen faucet. Charlotte, taken by surprise but pleased by the gesture, welcomed him in. As they worked side by side in the small kitchen, the air between them seemed charged with something unspoken. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same wrench, and both froze for a moment, exchanging a glance that lingered too long. "Thank you for always listening," Oliver said softly, breaking the silence. His voice carried a vulnerability Charlotte hadn't expected. "I don't know how I'd get through all this without you." Charlotte hesitated, torn between maternal concern and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort but which lingered longer than necessary. "You're stronger than you think, Oliver," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment passed quickly, but it left an indelible mark on both of them. What had started as innocent support was slowly morphing into something neither could fully control. Back at Riverside Heights, Olivia sensed the growing distance but couldn't pinpoint its cause. Oliver's absences became more frequent, and his explanations felt rehearsed. When she tried to reach out to him, he deflected, citing work stress or fatigue. At the same time, Charlotte began canceling their weekly tea sessions more often, offering vague excuses about being busy with her garden or not feeling well. Olivia chalked it up to coincidence, but a nagging feeling settled in the pit of her stomach, a sense that something wasn't right. As the summer days wore on, the cracks in the Fairborn family's foundation deepened. What had once been a strong and unified household now felt like a house of cards, teetering on the edge. And though Olivia couldn't yet see the full picture, she could feel it, the storm was coming. As the summer of 2022 faded into the cool, crisp air of September, the subtle tension between Oliver Fairborn and Charlotte Prescott continued to escalate. What had started as an innocent exchange of confidences during occasional visits had quietly transformed into something far more dangerous, something neither of them had fully acknowledged, or perhaps, neither of them wanted to admit. The line between comfort and attraction had blurred, leaving them both at a precipice they could not easily step away from. Olivia, oblivious to the growing intimacy between her husband and her mother, remained consumed by her own emotional storm. She poured herself into her art, unable to escape the ever-present shadow of infertility. Each stroke of the brush seemed to mirror her inner turmoil, yet it also served as a form of escape, a way to keep the pain at bay. She didn't see the subtle changes in Oliver's behavior, or the way Charlotte's visits were becoming more frequent, more intense. She couldn't, or perhaps she didn't want to. Meanwhile, Oliver found himself drawn to Charlotte in a way he had never expected. The sense of relief he felt in her presence was undeniable. Charlotte was older, wiser, and carried with her an air of maturity that made Oliver feel seen, understood. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the crushing weight of his failures as a husband, nor the expectations of success that defined his professional life. With Charlotte, he could be vulnerable, and that vulnerability made him feel alive. It wasn't long before their secret meetings became more calculated. Oliver would find excuses to leave work early or run errands, while Olivia was preoccupied with the upcoming art exhibition she was planning for her students. He would show up at Charlotte's cottage in Rosewood Hollow, under the guise of helping her with some small repairs or checking on her garden. Charlotte, too, began to craft reasons to see him, always making sure Olivia was distracted when he arrived. The first truly dangerous moment came during a quiet afternoon in mid-September, when Oliver arrived at Charlotte's cottage to fix a leaky faucet, an issue that, as Charlotte had later admitted, had already been taken care of days before. He found her in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she moved about, preparing a light lunch. The moment he stepped inside, the air seemed to change. The familiar comfort between them had shifted, and Oliver, for the first time, realized just how much he craved her company. Charlotte turned and smiled when she saw him standing in the doorway. Her eyes, warm and inviting, lingered on him longer than necessary, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The sound of a distant bird chirping, the faint rustle of the trees outside, everything seemed to fade into the background. "You're early today," Charlotte remarked softly, her voice carrying a note of anticipation. "I thought I'd stop by to check on you," Oliver replied, his tone casual, but there was an underlying tension in his voice, a note of something unspoken. Charlotte set down the dish she had been preparing and walked toward him. She stopped just a foot away, looking up into his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Their proximity was undeniable, and the silence between them thickened with an undeniable weight. Without thinking, Charlotte reached up, brushing a loose strand of hair from his forehead, the simple gesture sending a jolt of electricity through them both. "You look tired," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been working too hard, Oliver. You deserve a break." The words, though meant as concern, carried with them a strange, intimate undertone. For a moment, Oliver forgot about everything, his wife, the guilt, the consequences. All that mattered was the woman standing before him, offering him an escape, a release from the pressure that had built up in him for so long. He stepped closer, closing the gap between them, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. Charlotte looked up at him, her lips parting slightly, her gaze softening. The distance between them was no longer a gap to be bridged, it was a line they had already crossed. And in that instant, something shifted. The line they had both carefully skirted for months was no longer a boundary, they had crossed it without even realizing. Their kiss was slow, tentative at first, but as the reality of what they were doing sank in, the kiss deepened. It was a kiss born of longing, of shared loneliness, of forbidden desire. They pulled away slowly, both breathless, standing in the kitchen as though the world outside had ceased to exist. The weight of what had just happened loomed over them, but neither could bring themselves to speak. It wasn't a moment of regret, it was the beginning of something darker, something neither of them fully understood but both of them had been seeking for too long. The affair between Oliver and Charlotte, though still secret, grew in intensity as the weeks passed. Their encounters became more frequent, and their interactions increasingly charged. Each meeting was filled with the electricity of their desire, the tension hanging heavy in the air. They stole moments together in the garden, in the kitchen, behind closed doors at Charlotte's cottage, their hearts racing each time they heard the sound of a car in the driveway, or the distant hum of Olivia's voice. Olivia, meanwhile, had begun to notice the subtle changes in Oliver's behavior. He was more distant, more irritable when they did have time together. He dismissed her concerns about their growing emotional distance, explaining it away with vague excuses about work or stress. But there was something about the way he would avoid her gaze, the way he would flinch when she touched him, that made Olivia begin to doubt her perception of their relationship. Yet, the truth seemed too unbelievable, too painful to confront. She refused to believe that Oliver, the man she had married and built a life with, could betray her, especially with her own mother. And so, she buried her doubts beneath the surface, continuing to focus on her work and her art. But the cracks in her marriage were becoming more visible, and soon, she would have no choice but to face the truth. For now, however, the affair between Oliver and Charlotte thrived in secrecy, each moment more dangerous than the last. The forbidden nature of their relationship gave it an undeniable intensity, a thrill that made it feel more real than anything they had ever experienced. But beneath the excitement, the seeds of guilt and shame were beginning to grow, and neither of them could yet comprehend the devastation that would soon follow. The air in the Fairborn household had changed in subtle yet unmistakable ways. What had once felt like a safe haven of shared routines and mutual respect now simmered with unspoken tensions, and Olivia could no longer ignore the creeping feeling that something was wrong. The small, everyday signs, the distracted look in Oliver's eyes, the late nights, his increasingly curt responses, were beginning to coalesce into a picture she didn't want to see but couldn't avoid. It was a cool Tuesday in early November when Olivia decided to surprise Oliver with lunch at his office. She had spent the morning finalizing the details for her upcoming student exhibition, and after a few hours of work, she felt a rare wave of optimism. She grabbed a thermos of soup, picked up some fresh bread from the bakery, and drove across town to Oliver's office. As she arrived, her heart lifted slightly at the thought of seeing him and spending a quiet afternoon together, away from the tensions that had been building. However, when she arrived at his office building, the reception was confused. His secretary, a young woman Olivia had seen only occasionally, seemed flustered. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Fairborn," she said, looking up from her computer screen. "Mr. Fairborn left earlier today. He mentioned a meeting with a client, but I wasn't aware of him having any appointments this afternoon." A wave of unease swept through Olivia, but she dismissed it, thinking perhaps it was a simple misunderstanding. "No problem, he must be busy," she said, trying to sound casual. But as she stepped back into her car, something shifted inside her. She glanced at her watch. Oliver had left earlier than usual, and it wasn't like him to forget about lunch with her. The seed of doubt that had been slowly growing inside her mind now found fertile ground. For the next few days, the unease didn't subside. Oliver's behavior grew more erratic. He would frequently take calls late at night, speaking in hushed tones, his words muffled by the door closing behind him. His usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced with an air of distracted annoyance, and Olivia found herself questioning every interaction. When she attempted to engage him in conversation, he would brush her off, citing stress from work or upcoming business trips. It was during one of these moments that Olivia noticed something chilling. She had been sitting in their living room, reading over some sketches for an art piece, when she saw the faint outline of a lipstick stain on a coffee mug Oliver had brought home earlier that week. The color was unfamiliar to her, deep red, almost as though someone else had used it. Her heart skipped a beat, and a surge of nausea rolled through her. The next day, Olivia confronted him about the stain, trying to keep her voice steady. "Oliver, whose lipstick was that on your mug?" "It's not mine." Oliver's reaction was immediate, almost too quick. "It's nothing, Olivia." "I don't know how it got there," he snapped, his tone defensive. "Maybe it's from the office. Someone must have used it." His words felt rehearsed, lacking any genuine explanation, and the seed of suspicion in Olivia's mind sprouted into something far more solid. The whispers of doubt grew louder over the following days. Olivia began paying closer attention to the small details she had previously ignored. She watched how Oliver would avoid her gaze when she touched him, how he would hastily put down his phone when she entered the room, and how he seemed uncomfortable in her presence. The wall between them, once small and inconspicuous, was now tangible, almost suffocating. It was a Saturday afternoon in November when Olivia finally decided she could no longer live in the shadow of uncertainty. She couldn't continue second-guessing every moment, analyzing every look, every word. The truth had to be out in the open. Her heart pounded as she decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, and the nagging suspicion that had been eating away at her would only continue to gnaw at her if she didn't confront it head-on. On a whim, she decided to visit Charlotte's cottage in Rosewood Hollow. She hadn't seen her mother in a while. Perhaps a quiet afternoon with her would help clear her mind. She grabbed her keys and left, feeling an unsettling sense of urgency in the pit of her stomach. As she drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets leading to Charlotte's home, a wave of unease overtook her. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. When she turned onto the quiet lane leading to Charlotte's cottage, her breath hitched. She saw it. Oliver's car, parked right behind Charlotte's house. Her heart slammed in her chest, and her palms grew clammy. She could tell herself it was a coincidence, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. The knot of dread in her stomach twisted tighter. She parked her car at the end of the driveway and sat in the silence of the car for a few moments, trying to convince herself it was nothing. But deep down, she knew she had to see for herself. With trembling hands, she walked toward the door. She hesitated for a moment, but the urge to know the truth overcame her. As she reached for her key, her breath caught in her throat. She unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside, her heart hammering in her chest. The sight she found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. There they were. Oliver and Charlotte, locked in an intimate embrace on the floral-patterned couch, oblivious to her presence. Charlotte's hair was disheveled, her clothes rumpled, and Oliver's shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the start of his chest. The room was filled with the scent of wine and perfume, mingling in the air like a sickeningly sweet reminder of their betrayal. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Olivia's heart shattered, and the ground beneath her feet felt like it was crumbling away. The world she had carefully constructed, the marriage she had poured everything into, was nothing but a lie. As the shock began to wear off, a wave of pain, betrayal, and fury consumed her. She could barely breathe, her vision blurring with tears. Oliver's head snapped up as he heard the door creak open. His face went pale, his eyes wide with shock and guilt. Charlotte, too, looked up, her face draining of color as she pulled away from Oliver, her hands shaking. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. "Olivia," Oliver stammered, standing up quickly. "This isn't what it looks like." But the words felt hollow. The lies, the deceit, the hidden moments, all of it came crashing down around them. Olivia's voice, when it finally came, was raw and trembling with pain. 6 months, she whispered through clenched teeth, her face contorted with anguish. "It started as a friendship, didn't it? just a friendship." Charlotte remained frozen, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry, Olivia," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened." But Olivia couldn't hear their excuses anymore. The truth was too much to bear. She turned on her heel and fled from the cottage, the sound of their voices fading behind her as the door slammed shut. The curtain of secrecy had been ripped apart, and the lives of the Fairborn family would never be the same. The truth was out, and now, nothing could stop the devastation that would follow. The days following Olivia's discovery were a blur of pain, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The vision of her mother and her husband locked in that intimate embrace replayed in her mind endlessly, like a loop she couldn't escape. Every corner of their home, every object that once felt like a symbol of their shared life, now seemed like a painful reminder of the lies that had been woven around her. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think straight. The raw ache in her chest never ceased, gnawing at her, and the thought of facing Oliver or Charlotte again filled her with a fury so intense she could hardly breathe. For the next few days, Oliver had tried to reach out to her, calling, texting, even showing up at their house when she wasn't home, pleading with her to talk. He was desperate to explain, to make her understand that the affair had been a mistake, that it had meant nothing. But Olivia couldn't hear it. Every word that came out of his mouth felt like an insult. Every apology, a lie. It was on the evening of December 15, 2022, that the tension reached its breaking point. Olivia had spent the entire day in a haze of grief and fury, unable to focus on anything but the burning question of what she should do. The cold, simmering anger that had taken root inside her now had nowhere to go, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt a resolve growing in her, a cold, undeniable resolve. If they wanted to destroy her, to rip apart everything she had worked for, they would pay for it. She didn't know what that meant exactly, but the thought of confronting them, of finally facing her betrayers, was the only thing that kept her from losing herself completely. Oliver, sensing that his window of opportunity was closing, had returned home early that evening. His arrival was not the triumphant reunion he had hoped for but a return to a battlefield. As he stepped through the door, he felt the immediate shift in the atmosphere, the heavy silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Olivia was waiting for him in the dimly lit living room, the only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. He hung his coat on the rack, a nervous energy in his movements, as if he expected Olivia to be standing there, ready to forgive him. But when he turned around to face her, he stopped dead in his tracks. There she was, her posture rigid, her eyes bloodshot and hollow from the sleepless nights. "Olivia," he started, his voice shaky but hopeful. "We need to talk." Olivia didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge his presence at first, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his, and the look she gave him was enough to freeze him in place. There was no warmth left in her gaze. There was only fury, cold and raw. "I know everything, Oliver," she said, her voice low but steady, as though the words had been rehearsed 1,000 times. "About you and my mother. About the lies. The excuses. The betrayal. I saw it with my own eyes. Don't try to deny it." Oliver's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize again, but the words caught in his throat. There was no easy way out. He knew this. His chest tightened as the reality of the situation hit him all at once. "Olivia, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I never meant for this to happen. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness. I love you." Olivia took a step forward, her fists clenched at her sides, the anger radiating off her like heat. She had been through hell these past few days, but now, in this moment, she felt a clarity she hadn't known before. His words meant nothing. They were empty. She had been fooled, manipulated, and used. And the worst part was that it wasn't just him who had done this to her, it was her own mother. "You don't love me, Oliver," she said, her voice growing colder. "You never did. You just wanted to keep me in my place. You wanted to keep me as the perfect wife while you played your little game behind my back. And now you want to come back and pretend like none of this ever happened?" Oliver stepped toward her, his hands outstretched as if to calm her. "Please, Olivia, I am so sorry. I made a mistake. I'll do anything to make this right. Just give me a chance." But Olivia could barely hear him. The pounding of her heart drowned out his words. She was losing control of the emotions that had been building inside her, the fury that had consumed her for days. She felt it boiling over, the anger surging up from the pit of her stomach, the need for retribution stronger than anything she had ever felt before. Her breath quickened as her vision blurred with tears and rage. Without thinking, she turned sharply and walked toward the hallway. Oliver called after her, but she didn't stop. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she couldn't bring herself to care. She moved swiftly to his study, the room that had once been their sanctuary, the place where Oliver kept the things that made him feel powerful, in control. And there it was, sitting in the drawer of his desk, the handgun he had insisted on keeping after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. A symbol of his need for security, for dominance. Now, it felt like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in their lives. Olivia's hands trembled as she pulled the gun from the drawer. The cold metal felt alien in her grip, but at the same time, it gave her a strange sense of power. She turned around and walked back into the living room, her eyes locked on Oliver, who stood frozen in the middle of the room. He looked at her, his face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Olivia, please don't do this. I swear I'll make it right. Just give me a chance." But Olivia could barely hear him anymore. All she could see was the hurt, the betrayal, and the overwhelming pain that had been inflicted on her by the people she trusted the most. In one swift motion, she raised the gun. Oliver lunged forward, his hands raised in a desperate attempt to stop her. "No! Please!" he shouted, but it was too late. His body was already moving toward her, and in the chaos that followed, Olivia's finger tightened on the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, filling the room with an awful finality. Time seemed to stop as Oliver staggered backward, his hand pressed to his chest, blood seeping through his fingers. His eyes, wide with disbelief, locked with hers, and in that moment, the reality of what she had done hit her like a ton of bricks. The room fell silent. Olivia stood frozen, the gun slipping from her hand as the weight of her actions began to sink in. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. She could feel his shallow breaths beneath her fingertips, but it was too late. The damage had been done. As the sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, Olivia cradled Oliver's head in her lap. Her voice broke as she whispered apologies, but they felt hollow, meaningless. In the end, the destruction was complete, and the once perfect world they had built together had come crashing down. The Fairborn family was no more. The days following the tragic shooting were a blur of chaos, sirens, and the cold, clinical reality of the legal system. By the time the paramedics arrived at Riverside Heights, Oliver Fairborn had already slipped in and out of consciousness, his blood staining the hardwood floors beneath him. The once glamorous home, filled with art and love, was now a crime scene, its once welcoming doors thrown open to the harsh glare of flashing police lights. Olivia, in a daze, was led away in handcuffs, her face pale, her eyes hollow with the shock of her actions. She had done it. She had pulled the trigger. And now, she would face the consequences. The weight of what had happened hung over her like a suffocating fog, but there was no escape. Her life, once filled with promise and love, had been shattered in an instant. The woman she had once been, full of creativity, optimism, and passion, now seemed like a distant memory. By the time the trial began in June 2023, Olivia had already become a figure of intense public interest. The town of Austin, Texas, which had once regarded the Fairborns as one of its most respected families, was now divided. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues had their own opinions, and the media circus surrounding the case only heightened the drama. Olivia was charged with aggravated assault, though the prosecution had initially aimed to bring more severe charges of attempted murder. The court was filled with anticipation. In the months since the shooting, much of the town had come to sympathize with her, understanding the emotional devastation she had endured. Still, others viewed her actions as unforgivable, an impulsive act of revenge that deserved full punishment. The trial began with a heavy atmosphere, the air thick with tension. The prosecutor, Victor Harlow, wasted no time painting a picture of Olivia as a woman driven by vengeance, consumed by jealousy and rage at her husband's betrayal. He portrayed her as a woman who had, after years of trying to have a child, been unable to bear the weight of both infertility and her husband's affair. He argued that Olivia had carefully planned the attack, knowing exactly when and where to strike, and that her actions had been a calculated response to her shattered marriage. Harlow spoke of how Olivia had been rejected, humiliated, and left emotionally shattered by the two people she loved most in the world. Her relationship with Oliver, once idealized by the community, had been nothing more than a carefully curated facade. His words were sharp and cutting, each accusation a blow that left Olivia feeling even more detached from the person she had been before that fateful night. On the defense side, Margaret Dawson, Olivia's seasoned attorney, presented a different narrative, a woman pushed to the edge by years of emotional torment. She argued that Olivia's actions had been an overwhelming result of the betrayal she had endured. The defense painted her as a victim, a woman driven to madness by the years of neglect from her husband and the anguish caused by her mother's infidelity. Dawson highlighted Olivia's stellar reputation in the community, her years of dedication to her students, and her history of kindness and empathy. She didn't shoot her husband because of anger, Dawson argued. She shot him because, in that moment, the weight of everything, her infertility, her husband's affair, her mother's betrayal, crushed her spirit. It wasn't cold, calculated murder. It was a desperate cry for justice. A cry for relief. Dawson went on to describe the emotional turmoil Olivia had experienced leading up to the tragedy, how the once perfect marriage had deteriorated under the pressure of unspoken pain. She also pointed to the vulnerability of Charlotte, Olivia's mother, and how the family dynamic had been poisoned by long-standing emotional wounds. The defense painted a picture of a woman who was not a cold-blooded murderer, but a deeply wounded individual, whose mental state at the time of the shooting was significantly compromised. It was a plea for compassion, for understanding that the tragic events had not unfolded in a vacuum, but as the culmination of years of personal and emotional suffering. As the days of the trial wore on, the courtroom became a battleground not just for justice, but for public opinion. The media was relentless, with every new detail being picked apart and scrutinized. Olivia's past, her relationship with Oliver, her mother's secrets, all became fodder for the headlines. The trial was more than a legal proceeding, it had become a spectacle, with people in the town both sympathizing with her and condemning her actions. The most difficult moment came when Charlotte Prescott, Olivia's mother, took the stand. Her face, once proud and strong, now appeared worn and fragile, marked by guilt and shame. She had been at the heart of the betrayal that had caused so much pain in her daughter's life, and now, as she faced Olivia from the witness stand, there was no denying the weight of her actions. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Charlotte said, her voice trembling. I loved Olivia. I never wanted to hurt her." Her words hung in the air, but there was no turning back. She had failed as a mother and a person, and now she was being forced to reckon with the devastating consequences. Olivia, sitting in the defendant's chair, watched her mother speak, her expression unreadable. Inside, a storm of emotions raged. The woman she had once looked up to, the one person she had always turned to for comfort, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. And now, Olivia had to decide, could she forgive her? Or would the pain of what had been done to her, by both Oliver and Charlotte, destroy her beyond repair? The jury deliberated for 3 days. The tension was unbearable. Olivia's future was on the line, and yet, in the silence of the courtroom, there was no certainty about what the verdict would be. Would they see her as a victim of circumstance? Or would they hold her accountable for the violent act that had shattered her life, and the lives of those she loved? Finally, the jury returned. As the foreman stood and delivered the verdict, Olivia held her breath. The room seemed to spin as the words rang out, guilty of aggravated assault, a lesser charge than the attempted murder the prosecution had sought. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, some in shock, others in relief. Olivia, stunned, barely registered the moment as her lawyer patted her shoulder in silent consolation. The judge then announced the sentence, 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. Olivia's legs went weak beneath her, and she had to be helped up by her lawyer. The weight of the decision was too much for her to comprehend. As Olivia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the last image that stayed with her was the face of Charlotte, her mother, watching her with tears in her eyes. There was no redemption, no reconciliation for what had been done. Only time could tell what the future held for Olivia, but for now, she would have to face the consequences of the night that had changed everything. And as the door to the courtroom closed behind her, the world she once knew was left in ruins. The years following Olivia Fairborn's trial were nothing short of transformative. For most, the idea of rebuilding a life after such a devastating, irreversible event seemed impossible. Yet, as time passed, Olivia found herself in the strange, painful process of healing, a process she never could have imagined before that fateful night in December 2022. By the time she was released on parole in 2026, she was no longer the woman who had walked into that courtroom 3 years ago. The grief, rage, and confusion that had consumed her were still a part of her, but they no longer defined her. Olivia had spent the years in prison doing what she had always done best, pouring herself into her art. She had started painting again, this time with a focus on healing and transformation. The abstract images of chaos, which once represented her inner turmoil, had evolved into pieces of strength, resilience, and growth. Prison had not been kind, but it had been the most necessary space for Olivia to confront the woman she had become, and the one she had once been. She had to come to terms with the choices she had made, with the consequences of those choices. The time had allowed her to look inward, to examine the pain, the love, and the bitterness that had led to her actions. It was a long, difficult journey, but Olivia had found some semblance of peace with herself by the time she walked out of the prison gates. Oliver, for his part, had recovered from his physical wounds, but he was never the same man. The gunshot had left scars on his body, but the scars on his soul were far more profound. His marriage to Olivia was a casualty of his own mistakes and selfishness. After a lengthy period of attempts to repair their relationship, he moved to New York, seeking a fresh start. They barely communicated after the trial, exchanging only formal letters in the years that followed, but there was a sense of quiet understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the shared pain and regret that lingered. As for Charlotte, she was a shadow of the woman she had once been. The guilt of betraying her daughter had aged her, leaving her physically and emotionally frail. She had become a recluse in the small cottage in Rosewood Hollow, refusing to speak to the media or the people who had once been her friends. Her guilt was a constant weight on her shoulders, and the community had all but forgotten her. Charlotte had tried to visit Oliver in the hospital, but her attempts had been rebuffed by the Fairborn family. She spent her days alone, lost in the memory of her actions and the immense cost they had exacted. For Austin, and for the Fairborn family, life slowly moved on. The tragedy had left an indelible mark on the community. People spoke of it in whispers, unsure of what to say, but the memory of that night lingered like smoke in the air. Some found themselves sympathizing with Olivia, seeing her as a woman who had suffered the ultimate betrayal, and believed that her punishment had been enough. Others, however, saw her as a criminal, unable to forgive the violence that had been wrought in the heat of passion. But amidst the sorrow, there was also a lesson that hung in the air like a warning. The fragility of trust, the consequences of unchecked emotional pain, and the dangers of letting resentment fester were all apparent in the aftermath. For Olivia, the journey to redemption was only beginning. She had spent years locked in a physical prison, but her true journey was the one of self-discovery and healing that lay ahead. As Olivia took her first steps toward building a new life, there was no going back. Her experiences had shaped her, and she would carry them with her always. But she knew one thing with certainty: it was time to move forward. Her story, one of betrayal, pain, and violence, was now a part of her. But it was not the whole of her. She had the power to redefine herself, to find meaning in the darkness, and to learn from the wreckage that had been left behind. She was ready to embrace the future, even if that future was uncertain. The lesson of the past was clear: forgiveness, healing, and growth were possible, but they required facing the truth head-on and accepting the pain that came with it. What do you think about Olivia's story? Do you think her actions were justified, or should she have taken a different path? How do you think Charlotte and Oliver's betrayal affected her? Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more thought-provoking true crime stories, and share this video with your friends to see what they think. We'd love to hear your opinions and experiences. Join the conversation now.